So awareness of what has been tried before can be the first step of the innovation process. So today's episode will try to examine whether there are any lessons for Africa from the development experience of East Asia, which it could then build on. South Korea and Taiwan achieved economic development in the space of 20 years, and their economic trajectories were often referred to as the East Asian miracle. What was it that allowed them to leapfrog to the status of developed countries and technological innovators in such a short period? Today, I have the enormous pleasure of welcoming one of my old professors from the London School of Economics, James Putzel, who taught me all about the East Asian miracle and its replicability. I'm not sure I want to say it, but yes, I think it was 30 years ago. So, so I wonder if he has changed his mind about any of this. And so together with him, I have Bethel Tsegaye, the CEO of Pharo Ventures Ethiopia, who will share the challenges that she faces as an African entrepreneur and what her views are on the replicability of the East Asian model in the African context. So just a few words on both of them. James is Professor of Development Studies in the International Development Department at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he served as head of department between 1999 2001 and director of the Crisis States Research Center from 2001 to 2011. He now co-directs the MSc in Development Studies. He was a member of the International Advisory Board of the China International Development Research Network. He was also a founding member of the Fragile States Council of the World Economic Forum and has served as managing editor of the Journal of Development Studies and on the boards of several other academic journals. He is well known for his research in the Philippines, where he has maintained active research since 1984. His articles and books on development have examined agrarian reform, agricultural transformation, industrialization, and politics in developmental states, democratic transitions, social capital, NGOs and civil society, nationalism, armed conflict, communist movements, development aid, and the role of political Islam. So I can basically ask him whatever. His research and publications on Africa have analyzed the politics of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, land reform in South Africa, state fragility, and political settlements. And he has carried out research in Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, the DRC, Senegal, Malawi, and South Africa. James is joined by Bethel Tsegaye, the country director of Pharo Foundation Ethiopia, as well as CEO of Pharo Ventures Ethiopia. Bethel worked for various funds and venture builders focusing on Africa. She has over 15 years experience, having worked in various private sector organizations in different parts of the world. Bethel has extensive experience investing in early stage ventures in sectors including agribusiness, fintech, healthcare, and manufacturing. James, we can now kick it off with you. I did look at some of my old notes from the courses I took with you, but I think it is best if you summarize for us what you see as the role of the private sector in the East Asian miracle and how it related to the state's developmental vision.
Sure. Hi, I'm really happy to be here. The private sector played an absolutely pivotal role in these East Asian developmental states, as we call them. So they were different in each country. So in Japan and Korea, we saw the role of big private conglomerates, the Zaibatsu, the Chaebols. In Taiwan, it was more small and medium enterprises in the private sector working along with state companies. But, the key condition for the developmental state to emerge had to do with the configuration of power between the state and private actors, private elites. So in all three of these cases, there was land reform. because of very mobilized rural populations, etc. And this happened before the establishment of developmental states. Not something a developmental state did, but as a matter of kind of survival of the polity. And that had a big impact in terms of the power configuration between the state and private sector, because no longer could wealthy families kind of accumulate their wealth based on accumulating land. So they were driven towards investing in urban areas and in manufacturing, this kind of thing. This was really important because it meant that in relationship to the state and private actors, there was a certain amount of leverage on the part of the public authorities. But the private sector had to concede, in a way, to the creation of state capacity. So as soon as there was a political organization in the state that had kind of development vision, the private sector went along with capacity creation. This is really important to understand. This is not an inheritance of history or colonialism, et cetera. It's a political decision to create the capacity to manage finance, to understand technology, to begin to understand what world markets look like, and this kind of thing. So that capacitizing of the state was really important, and the private sector went along with it. But also, state organizations had to perform in order to maintain their legitimacy with private actors. Really important. These states were under various kinds of threats and difficult environments, etc. And they had to show private actors that they had credible commitment, that they would deliver what they said they would do, and they would also punish those who broke the rules. So that was a really key aspect of the relationship between them. This led to what Peter Evans, famous author on the developmental state, called embedded autonomy. So states were, in a sense, embedded in society among elites. They met often with businesses. Businesses transmitted information about the market or technology needs, etc., to the state. And once you had a kind of strategic direction for from the state, from the political authorities to produce for export markets, then the state would provide a lot of finance, subsidies, protection, etc., to these companies, but they had to perform in export markets or it was taken away. So private sector, absolutely pivotal, but it's this relationship between the public authority and the private sector, which was so important.
Fascinating, James. It all comes back to me.
I hope it's maybe more profound than it was 30 years ago.
Absolutely. So that's the sort of, general sort of structure of it. If we think about, how this affected innovation in particular, can you tell us a little bit more about what impact this kind of setup had on innovation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that was central to the developmental state experience. So I could give you maybe two examples to explain how this worked. So one is in the semiconductors sector. So both countries started, encouraging, or the states encouraged their companies to get involved in information technology. They had originally started with just some assembly operations that were plugging into the very cheap labor and abundant labor they had in Taiwan and South Korea. But then as Japan kind of moved out of sort of middle level technology in that sector, in both countries, there were moves by the private sector, encouraged by the state, to kind of upgrade what they do in semiconductors. So Korea had these big conglomerates, as I said. So they started getting involved with, the subsidies and assistance from the state in producing en masse memory chips. Taiwan had smaller businesses, and of course, a kind of smaller business sector as a whole, and so they headed towards the production of electronic circuitry, and it was it was really important what the state did in both countries to promote this leap forward into more innovative realms of technology. So in Korea, we know the story of Samsung and how it emerged over time with real they had real organizational economies of scale beyond technological economies of scale because they were a big emergent conglomerate. In Taiwan, the state really engineered, first of all, set up a state company to get into electronic circuitry. They engaged in various joint ventures, they acquired technology, and they enlisted private sector actors into this process. And those private sector actors were rewarded for the innovations they made. So eventually, the state set up a company that we all know about now, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TMSC, which by now today is the world's leading producer of microchips and most advanced nanochips, et cetera. So this was, really important. The private sector actors, big and small, and in Taiwan, a lot of them were small, innovator. You could talk about them today as startups who were able to gain assistance in acquiring the technology and rewarded for doing it to make TMSC one of the leading companies in the sphere. We have a similar story with Hyundai in Korea. So Hyundai started out, it was in construction, pretty basic construction, and it went on from there with state support to get involved, to diversify its activities and adopt some of the latest technologies to do that, and cement industry. And then, of course, we know they went into steel, and we know they went into automobiles very successfully. So this really has been a kind of joint effort between the state and the private sector, with real rewards built in for good performance of private sector, but also rewards or subsidies or support withdrawn if they couldn't perform in international export markets. So that's a bit of an idea of how innovation was promoted in those places.
Excellent. Thank you, James. Moving on to Bethel, if we kind of start from the assumption that, that there is not the same degree of developmental state in Africa, which, either of you is welcome to question that assumption. But if that's the assumption, does it mean that the private sector then has to assume some of its features and drive the developmental process? And can it do that effectively? And are there any dangers, do you think, Bethel, involved in doing that without any limits on the private sector?
Thank you, Francesca. It's really super interesting to hear James talking about those Asian countries' experiences, because I think if I'm to give the example of Ethiopia, for example, the journey we've been on since maybe 2010, and James knows about this as well, is Ethiopia did try to implement a state-led development to a certain extent. And that started back in 2010. And the first phase of that, GTP1, went on from 2010 to 2015. And GTP2 was built on that from 2015, 2019. And a lot of the focus was on infrastructure development. So a lot of emphasis was given in terms of connecting regions, but also developing roads that are connecting rural areas to urban centers. Basically, the whole idea is we need the basic infrastructure first to actually have private sector coming in and have a plug-in and play model. And to a certain extent, that did work. And they also extended that beyond road connectivity into access to key services key essential services like access to schools, access to health centers, and so on. So there was a lot of emphasis built on building things. And then the idea was private sector will come in and plug in and play on that. However, where I think I see the disconnect, especially as I hear James talking to the role the private sector played in these Asian economies, is we didn't have that to the degree that it's required for the private sector to also participate along this journey. Policies were really not, ease of doing business was not really great for private actors to come in and plug in and play. There was a lot of currency restriction, forex issues. Just in general, we didn't have a very favorable tax policies for to attract corporates also to come in and create the jobs that are needed to uplift these economies out of poverty. So there was that disconnect. However, where we are now, Ethiopia is now implementing a new policy, a homegrown economic policy, which is very much focused on putting the private sector in the front to drive economic growth. And that's to be seen. We're just starting to roll it out. And I still feel there's quite a lot of room for improvement in terms of private sector's actors coming in and playing their part, especially around innovation. From the government's perspective, it's the policy or the environment for innovation has to be incredibly fostering, sort of like building a sandbox tool for companies to trial out things and be able to scale with a certain level of protection from government to be able to accelerate that growth. So I feel like there's been that disconnect in the African context where the state plays its role as a state, focusing on providing the key infrastructures but also taking the private sector along that journey with them. I feel like there's a big gap in that space in the African context.
Any comment on that, James, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think you're doing down the Ethiopian experience too much. It sort of went sour maybe from about 10 years ago, but there was a good period of 20 years or so of growth and diversification of activity. And you're probably right that you have, for various reasons, less dynamism in the private sector. You certainly didn't really see the big families, partly because of historical reasons, emerging as conglomerates. But there were some very important, sectoral achievements beyond the state-owned telecommunications and one of the best airlines in the world that was established, which had, at least foreign involvement as well as state involvement. You saw sectors like horticulture with some really innovative, technology. There's a study done at the School of Oriental and African Studies by some colleagues of mine there on what they call the economy of freshness. So a lot of technological innovation in the horticultural sector, which has the promise of emerging and doing the job that it's even made us rethink the difference between agriculture and manufacturing, because it's very technology intensive, requires capital, advanced marketing technology, communications. That infrastructure that was built helped to get those horticultural products, both to the airports, and the airlines helped to get them, to European markets. So I would say that they made some important headway with that. We have to remember that, 1960, South Korea was considered, it had a lower per capita income than Ghana. It was considered a basket case compared to the Philippines. And now its per capita income is 10 times the Philippines. And of course, it has these leading industrial sectors. So it took this kind of process takes a while. I mean, I would just add that. Maybe later we can come back to the other examples in other African countries where I think, there is a lot of signs of, developmental state activity.
Yeah. Maybe we can finish with that at the end. I just want to probe Bethel a little bit in terms of, you know, her private sector experience. You know, in this context, as an African entrepreneur, what would you say are the greatest challenges that you encounter in your pursuit of corporate growth, innovation, and value creation?
Sure. I think one of the things, again, that attracts us to the African market is the opportunities and the ability to build things, and also the opportunity to create more impact as you build on these companies. One of the issues is a lot of whatever sectors that you look at, or whatever ventures or business opportunities that you look at, chances are value chains are incredibly fragmented. And it's up to the business or that private sector to make sure that they have a certain level of, you know, a degree of control in their backward or forward integration into the value chains that they're looking at. And that's mainly because it's just you don't have a thriving private sector in these economies. So the private sectors end up having to build beyond what their core business is, doing that forward integration or backward. They're having to think about how logistics is going to affect their business because their reliability is very questionable. So that fragmentation really increases the cost of doing business in Africa. And of course, financing, needless to say, capitals are not that much available, especially as a startup, or if you're an early stage business. You're not lendable by the bank because you don't have a credit history. You're perceived as risky. So a lot of investors will shy away. So capital is the other major constraint for a lot of businesses in Africa.
Thanks, Bethel. So I guess to conclude, I think you know, from James's presentation of the facts, I think, you know, the developmental state was the prime condition of East Asian development. But one of the other conditions which has changed dramatically today is the rise of global value chains, and most recently a move to protectionism led by the US. And in this context, the question really is for you both. Do you see any evidence that developmental states could emerge in Africa, and that we could see accelerated development in the region on that basis? Maybe let's start with James.
Okay. You know, if we understand East Asian developmental state experience a little differently than it's often talked about, as just one instance of accelerated economic growth and human development, we get away from having a template or trying to see, well, we can't see what we saw in East Asia in Africa, and so there's no developmental state. You know, there has not been a growth experience, a development experience where the state has not come in and worked with private actors ever since England, you know, in the 18th century. So through the United States, through Germany, through the Nordic countries, there's always for that kind of accelerated development to happen, it requires this public and private action. And so, you know, when we look at it that way, I would say yes, you know, in terms of seeing states in the future working with private actors in African countries, why not? I mean, there's nothing that will stand in the way of that happening, though it's really difficult for all the reasons Bethel said, what she faces in her own, you know, enterprises and whatnot. But take a few examples. So look at Botswana. So Botswana was very poor trusteeship of the British. And, you know, they discovered after independence diamonds, and the political authorities in Botswana were able to develop a use and a direction of those natural resources into the creation of infrastructure, into expanding human development, you know, into downstream activity, taking over the processing of their diamonds, etc. So there was a real developmental instance there. And, and I would say also Rwanda, very poor country, but emerging out of the genocide, the political authorities in Rwanda did something kind of created what we might call this kind of embedded autonomy. In other words, a state that was in constant communication with private actors. And of course, they're still a very poor country, but they promoted new lines, new technology in agriculture. They got their coffee sector really upgraded so that we now find coffee in the niche markets of Europe coming from Rwanda. They built infrastructure to get those coffee to market. They supported businesses in establishing, the latest drying techniques and processing techniques for the coffee beans. And they've located now automobile assembly. Volkswagen has a plant in Rwanda. It's still really beginning, and it's very difficult. It's a landlocked country, and of course it's that was done under rather authoritarian setting. But we've seen develop. Japan was a democratic country. South Korea and Taiwan were authoritarian, but they moved to democracy. So Botswana has been a democracy throughout this period of late development. You could even look at a country like Nigeria, behemoth of Africa, the largest population there, still has the largest number of poor people in the country, but very diversified economy. And you look at a figure like Aliko Dangote, who mirrors the kind of chaebol in South Korea. It started in cement and went on into flour, diversified into automobile production, and now has built the first really large-scale refinery in Nigeria that could begin to see Nigeria, processing its own petroleum. So these are hopeful elements, I think. Bethel, you build up your business, but of course it requires political authorities to have a development vision, a plan, and to be, develop what I call credible commitment. They'll do what they say they'll do, and they'll punish private actors who don't follow the rules.
Yeah.
But I think we could see progress that way. So I hope the Pharo Foundation can support initiatives that do that.
Definitely. Bethel, you have the last word.
It's very hard to follow that one, but I do agree with a lot of the things that James has mentioned. And earlier he did say that this is a long-term game, so it's really a marathon. We sometimes are a bit unfair on our African brothers and countries. Like it does take a while. It's not an easy task to undertake, especially building a nation. But it does require a lot of commitment, and I think intentions as well. Like where do you really want to go? Be very incredibly intentional about where you see the direction of the country going. And there are some promising things that are popping up, all of the examples that James have mentioned as well, and what we're seeing in the region, in different places. And I think this protectionism will also force Africans to start trading between each other, because there really is no trade that's happening between different African countries. And the volume of trade that happens between African countries and the rest of the world is massive. But there isn't really much that's happening between the countries in Africa. And I think there's a lot of potential lying there that needs to be unlocked. And being an organization that's continental focused, at least within the East African region, I think Pharo in general has the capability to start testing some of those assumptions. What we're already working on in the agri space, for example, between Ethiopia, Somaliland, and Kenya, and health. There's quite a lot of opportunity that can be unlocked there. But again, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint, and it requires commitment and patience, definitely.
Excellent. Wow. Thank you did you want to add anything, James? Or?
No, I think you're absolutely right about the regional potential. We see the East African Economic Community actually coming together. And, we have this huge demographic change in Africa. So the market potential in Africa is gigantic going forward. And all those young people, if they can gain access to education, are going to be able to, supply the effort and the knowledge that's necessary to operate in regional trade. And you're absolutely right. In the face of what's happening in the United States and elsewhere, it becomes a necessity. And we know that's one of the messages from the East Asian experience. Development comes out of necessity, not just out of, some kind of desire.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, both. It's been a very insightful discussion. It was great to freshen up my views, James, and hear you both discuss this further. Thanks again.